While Indian nations face great opportunities today, they also face great challenges. So the question for today is, what are some of the realities of the situations that Indian nations find themselves today in, and how far have we come in American Indian history and in our understanding as well as interactions with Indian people? So today we are going to look at a situation that is kind of exemplary of what is happening in contemporary Native America. While there are a lot of successes, there are a lot of great things happening on Indian nations, they still face some challenges. So today what we're going to look at is kind of the confluence of where history meets science, culture, and what happens when those things meet when Indian nations and scientists attempt to resolve a situation. So the situation is one that begins in Pueblo Bonito. Pueblo Bonito is in Chaco Canyon, which is in New Mexico. It is a historical structure with many sites like the ones you see here in the picture. There are people who currently reside within New Mexico and the territory, so Native nations who claim ancestry and say that their ancestors came from Chaco Canyon. So the picture that you're looking at right here is that of Pueblo Bonito. Pueblo Bonito was a large gathering space for people to come, and they would gather, archaeologists believe now, as well as native tribes, throughout the year. It was more of a ceremonial grounds and a gathering place than it was a place for people to live year-round. So this structure was built between about 850 and 1150 AD, and there's about 600 to 800 rooms within the structure itself. So this is where the issue that we're going to talk about takes place. So at Pueblo Bonito in 1890, archaeologists came and started to take out a lot of the things that they found at Pueblo Bonito. They took out things like remains of ancestors. They took pot shards. They took different beads and things that they found at Pueblo Bonito. When they took those things, archaeologists in 1890, they sent them to the museum. It was the Museum of Natural History, and since that time it has been held by the Museum of Natural History. So the issue arises in that currently, just within the past couple of years, scientists as well as archaeologists decided that they wanted to test the remains that were found at Pueblo Bonito. What happened is that they wanted to see if they could unearth a little bit more of the mystery that still surrounds Chaco Canyon. Who lived there? Why did they live there? What did they do? What did the culture of the people look like? And so what they did is they asked the Museum of Natural History if they could have the ancestral bones that the museum had, which they had taken from Pueblo Bonito, to extract DNA sequences from to do some testing, to find out a little bit more about who lived there. So what happened as a result of this is some pretty phenomenal new findings. The scientific community was really excited. What happened, there were 14 individuals within this burial site in Pueblo Bonito. It was a site, if you look to the right here at these different objects that had beautiful pottery, as well as hundreds of thousands of turquoise beads. This was pretty unique. This was the largest area that they had ever seen with this many beads. In addition to the carved beads, the shells, the abalone shells that you see within this, there was also carved flutes and ceremonial staffs, leading the archaeologists as well as the scientists to believe that this was a burial site of great significance for Chaco Canyon. So what they found after testing the DNA of the ancestors who were buried within the Pueblo Bonito grave site is that the ancestors were members of an elite class. What they found is that they could trace the matrilineal ancestors of the people who were buried in this site back about 300 years, telling them that it was people who lived within Pueblo Bonito and they shared ancestry, and they were the ruling class within Chaco Canyon. And they ruled Chaco Canyon, Pueblo Bonito, that area, for roughly 300 years, accumulating that great wealth that you saw in the prior picture. So what they also connected was that because the ancestry was matrilineal, that it closely resembled the social structure of Pueblo people who lived nearby within New Mexico. So what's the big deal? What's the issue here that arises? Well, as you read in some of the final chapters of your Indian history book, we have something called NAGPRA, or the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. This act was passed in the 1970s during the time of self-determination. It was a time when civil rights became something that a lot of different people were striving for. And the way that NAGPRA was passed, I'll give you a little backstory here, is that in 1970, a woman named Maria from the Yankton Sioux tribe saw in Iowa that a road construction crew had dug up a gravesite. So within that gravesite, there were both white remains as well as Indian remains. So what she witnessed is those white remains were reburied. However, the remains of the Indian mother and the child that she saw were sent to a museum to study. This caused a lot of issues, obviously. It seemed like unequal treatment, unfair treatment, and she couldn't understand why Indian people didn't have the right to bury their ancestors as white people did. So in 1990, not until 1990, we have the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. What it does is it requires all public and private museums, like the Natural History Museum, the one I just spoke of, who receive federal funds to inventory Native artifacts and human remains. So once they have inventoried all of those remains as well as artifacts, they're supposed to consult with tribes. The idea of consultation with tribes is that they should offer to the tribes the chance to be able to bury their ancestors as well as reclaim artifacts that are sacred to the tribe. So obligations, as I mentioned prior to this under NAGPRA, is that museums are inventorying those artifacts and remains, and then they consult with tribes. Here's something that's kind of new and something that has changed since the original passage of the 1990 Act. Whereas traditionally, they were just supposed to consult with tribes where the remains were found. Now, the law states that technically, any institutions are supposed to consult with tribes on whose aboriginal lands the artifacts or remains were found. So say a tribe is currently on a reservation, they could go back and say, hey, we had original aboriginal lands in a different territory and we state a claim to these artifacts or remains based on that original aboriginal claim. So what happened at Pueblo Bonito? How does this all tie together? So what we learn after the testing had already been done of the ancestors at Chaco Canyon, the Museum of Natural History comes back and says, hey, we tried to contact tribes in the 1990s based on NAGPRA. We reached out and tried to contact any tribes that we thought were affiliated with the remains. However, tribes say on their behalf that they were never contacted by the museum, and secondarily, the museum is now saying that they are not going to say how they contacted tribes or how hard they tried to contact tribes. So there's a dispute now whether or not the Museum of Natural History actually contacted the tribes in the 1990s. Moreover, what we know is that the testing just happened in 2017. So is there any obligation of the museum to contact tribes after the 1990s? So in a report issued by the museum after the testing was done, they say, while most of all Pueblos may have had some association with ancestral Pueblo people of New Mexico's San Juan Basin, including similarities in ceramics, architecture, and subsistence practices, the nature of the connection is not sufficiently clear to warrant making a determination of cultural affiliation within the meaning of NAGPRA to all the Puebloan groups in New Mexico and Arizona. So basically saying that just because there's similarities, we can't make any sort of determination that there is cultural affiliation with Puebloan groups in Mexico, New Mexico. So other factual evidence to consider. So first you have the museum basically stating we don't have ties, we don't have any sort of evidence to show that there's cultural affiliation. However, at the same time, what they do know and what was happening is that the National Park Service was in communication with both the Pueblo and the Navajo tribes. In 2006, the National Park Service had actually handed over artifacts from Chaco Canyon, as well as remains, to both tribes. Navajo and Pueblo people, in addition, claim that their ancestors came from Chaco Canyon. So this is something that is well known, that has been stated, and is part of kind of the historical record that the museum knew, as well as archaeologists and scientists who went into Pueblo Bonito and asked the museum to study the 14 ancestors of the Pueblo and the Navajo. So the response to this was a large outcry. Indigenous researchers, as well as Native communities that are claiming ancestry from Chaco Canyon, including the Navajo and the Puebloan people, allied together, and they actually publish a paper. So within this paper, there are Indigenous researchers and allies that raise ethical concerns for what happens. What they state are three concerns. First of all, there was no tribal consultation during the study design. Not only did they fail to reach out to the tribes to see if they had any connection with the ancestral remains, but they didn't consult them, even if they would have consulted with them about whether or not they would have been able to study the remains. Secondarily, they felt like the actual study was culturally insensitive. The data was done very in a way that didn't identify the remains as ancestors, but rather identified them as skeletal remains. Third, there was no consideration for the ramifications on an already marginalized group. We'll go into what each of these mean a little bit more in terms of the concerns as they're laid out one after the other. So first of all, the lack of tribal consultation. So within the lack of tribal consultation, we have the concern over scientists being the ones looking at the evidence versus tribes being the ones that look at the evidence. So we go back again to this whole idea that started the class, the idea of scientific expertise versus indigenous knowledge. So if we look at ancestral remains, what the advocates were saying is that at face value, what's happening is by not consulting with tribes, you are ignoring tribal knowledge. You're ignoring the oral history the tribes have passed down. You're ignoring the origin stories the tribes have. Many tribes, the Navajo and the Pueblo, have ceremonies that are connected at Chaco Canyon with things that occurred at Chaco Canyon. You're also ignoring the knowledge that Navajo as well as Puebloan people have about family structures and their kinship system. So by ignoring this, you're saying that scientific expertise and what we can learn from the extraction of DNA trumps any knowledge that tribes have from their oral history and their stories and ceremonies of Chaco Canyon. What we also know is that Pueblo people had visited Chaco Canyon. They are closely tied to that park and they're tied to the national park system. So what is maybe even more